Dawn trespassed the cypress fringe like a careful thief, laying pale silver on the black water of the Chickahominy. A whippoorwill stitched its lonely name into the damp, and fog, thin as gauze, gathered in the hollow where the cooper's shed leaned against the ash yard. Lemuel Thorne woke before the horn, as he always did, listening for the weight of the day in the hush, the lick of river against pilings, the distant creak of the mill wheel, the rustle of pine straw under a fox passing where it pleased. He knew the plantation by sound as a blind man knows the map of his palm. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. He rolled from the pallet and set his soles to the dirt floor's cool ribs, palms on his knees, feeling the patience he learned from wood. There was always a way with wood: coax a stave to curve under steam, shoe a hoop snug, shave a lip just sweet enough to drink from. The world asked for patience, the river spoke it, Lemuel practiced it. A good barrel stayed true in a storm. And somewhere inside that patience, a sharper thing kept its edge, the art of watching without being watched. He crossed the yard before the first horn, headed for the cooper's shed while the sky still held the blue of night's last thought. The shed smelled of pitch and sap, a comfort to him. He took up the shave and set a white oak stave against the horse, eyes on the grain. The stave told him how it wanted to bend. He shaved with a rhythm that matched his own pulse, slow, constant, a prayer disguised as labor. His hands had been his teachers long before any letters crept into them. The letters were another matter. They lived in his mind like still fish in a deep pool, they moved at night and left no ripples. Lemuel had learned them under a layer of danger so steady he could taste it, like the iron in well water. Not from a book alone, though a rescue of one tattered primer from a traveling preacher had helped him a year ago, but from labels on molasses hogsheads, from the chalk names on crates down at Rocket's Landing, from a slip of a newspaper that had once wrapped bacon from the smokehouse and ended in the ash pile where Lemuel dug for nails and found words. He learned to nibble facts as a fox takes hens, quiet, quick, scarce a feather left. He planned while he shaved. He planned every morning. Planning was how a man kept ahead of fear and regret. A shadow crossed the open door. Jacob, 19 and all bone and mischief, ducked inside with the furtiveness men adopted when their thoughts ran faster than their feet. Lem, he whispered, mouth too near the word, breath quick. You hear it? They say he riding back. Lemuel wiped curls of oak from his fingers and kept shaving, only his eyes lifting. Who? Master's boy. The Richmond one. Ransom Bellamy. They say his studies made him smart enough to count us twice an hour. Jacob tried for a grin and failed. He aimed to run the place. Master's lungs ain't right. Lemuel kept the blade moving. Ransom Bellamy. The name came with a taste like spoiled milk. Lemuel had seen him last when the boy was 18 and mean with the pride of being watched. A rider who kept his hat on indoors. A voice that held laughter the way a cat holds a mouse, just enough pressure. But that wasn't the sharpest edge of the name. The sharpest edge ran under the skin where no one saw, a knowledge that had washed ashore in Lemuel's life and lay there like an unclaimed thing. His mama had once said, to no one, to the wall, to the low candle flame, the master's blood is a bad river. It feeds into itself. And then she said nothing for a month. There were times a face told the truth even when the tongue did not. Ransom's cheekbones, the tilt of his jaw when he smiled, Lemuel had seen those same lines in the mirror of creek water when he bent to wash, though he never lingered there. Some truths you step over like a cottonmouth sleeping. Get, Lemuel said kindly, gritting a smile at last. Bring me the hoop from the nail straightening. We got 15 barrels due to cross the river by noon. Jacob went, relief grateful for orders. Lemuel set the stave aside and laid another, the routine a guard dog at his heel. This plantation, Belfield, after some first owner's dream, sat with its toe in the river and its heel in the pine. Tobacco had eaten the soil once, now wheat and corn fought it for whatever could be coaxed from the red clay. Farther back, the swamp held more secrets than the big house ever could. The Chickahominy coiled low under cypress knees, then wandered out to the James like a child brought to church. Lemuel's other skill, the one the master liked, the one a man could not be kept from learning if he kept his eyes open, was the river. He could read water like scripture, where it ran shallow over sandbar, where the current bit under a fallen sycamore, where midnight gave you a shadow to move in. 100 small knowings made of freedom if you tied them together tight. By mid-morning, the yard had heated to the wet slap of July, though spring lingered in the hedgerows with its white tongue out. The horn brought everyone to the rows or the mill or the big house chores. Lemuel kept by the shed, counting hoops, ears tuned for hoofbeats. He heard them before the dogs did, the firm cadence of a bay gelding, the fancier clip of a trotter, voices like coin edges striking. The yard stiffened the way a horse does when a snake shows itself. Ransom Bellamy rode in at the head of 2 men and a boy, his hat tipped back as if Son were his servant. He had cut a beard since Lemuel last saw him. It tried to make his mouth look like a man's, but it only framed the boy who had never been refused. He dismounted with a flourish that wanted watching. His coat was the good kind, fawn cloth with cuffs too clean for anyone who worked, his boots polished like a dare. The boy leading the trotter had hunger in his eyes that no amount of food would help. "Mr. Bellamy," Overseer Ferris called, wiping his hands on a rag, moving close with his shoulders bowed just so, as men bow when they wish to keep their jobs. Ferris's face looked like a leather glove left in the rain. He was a careful man, and careful men are often the most dangerous. Ransom swung his gaze over the yard, letting it catch on faces as if they were game. It brushed Lemuel and slid off, paused on a woman carrying wash, lingered a moment too long. He smiled then, all white show and pink lip. "Where's my father?" he asked the overseer, his voice higher than his boots hoped. "Inside, sir." "The cough's back." Ransom wrinkled his nose as if the word cough offended him, then tugged off his gloves, snapping them against his thigh. His eyes returned to the yard. "I'll see it's gone. I'll see a good many things gone." A small shiver ran along the bodies gathered, the kind a dog feels when a storm thinks about it. Lemuel bent over his stave as the family swept into the big house, as the house door closed like a sentence. He worked until his shoulders loosened and his mind could move again, a fox reconnoitering. The first rule was always the same: let them think you are what they already believe. A man who worries a scrap of wood until it fits tends to be taken for a man who will fit himself into whatever scrap they hand him. At noon, he went to the river, rolling 2 finished barrels on their rims with the grace of practice. He delivered them to the skiff and said nothing when Ferris told him to take the west path because the east was too mired from last night's rain. Lemuel knew that was a lie dressed as instruction. The east had sand and a stiff bottom, the west swallowed carts, but he had asked Ferris for nothing in his life and didn't plan to start. He loaded the skiff quiet. When the last barrel nudged into place, he lifted the one with a corked scar along the bilge. Its bottom held a secret double with space waist deep. Empty, for now. He'd built it in winter when the sap sleeps, shaping the extra planks by lamplight with the door blocked and the shavings burned before dawn. You learn to keep crafts that could be used as tools for something larger than a man's day. One day was a measure only if you refused to look past it. He pushed off with the pole, the skiff kissing the bank goodbye. The Chickahominy took them like a mother with a mind to let go finally. Cypress knees jutted like broken fingers, and the water kept its secrets multiple. He let the pole bite the mud and then the current. He copied the heron who put down each foot as if the world might not hold him. Halfway up the slough where Cain leaned tight as a crowded pew, he let the skiff nudge a root and listened. 2 quick clicks and a long scrape, the way a woodpecker insisted on a dead limb when the live ones were taken. Lemuel's jaw eased. He gave 2 slow taps to the gunwale in reply, and a parting in the cane admitted Tempe Howell's bonnet and eyes. She appeared as she always did, like a woman whose life had no edges sharp enough to cut bread, much less rope. Quaker, widow, a patch of pocked cheek that made the self-conscious avoid her while she slipped past them into the heart of things. Temperance Howell held a small wicker basket as if it were a prayer, but her eyes were wrong for a woman who baked alone. They had the quick, measuring kindness of one who wished to save every creature and had learned she could not. "Mr. Thorne," she said, with that even northern clip, and then she put a hard currant loaf in his hands as if it were communion. No one called Lemuel Mister but this woman and Old Cuff when no one could hear. Mrs. Howell, he said, making her name small enough to pass unnoticed and reverent enough to warm. He lifted the barrel with the cork scar and let his palm rest on the third hoop. 3 taps, 1, then a pause and 2 taps more. She nodded once. Tonight, then. Do you bring me the list? She asked softly, too casually for it to be casual. Lemuel's hand went to the bread as if he meant to tear it. His thumb found the knife slit he'd made at noon, by habit. He slid out the scrap and kept his body a screen. The paper smelled faintly of bacon grease and oak. Letters walked across it in a code that had taken months to settle, first names as work tools, dates as hoop sizes, times as barrel counts. If anyone found it, it would read like a cooper's dreaming. If the wrong eyes saw the shapes, they would become gallows. She tucked it under the basket cloth without looking. Trust was a thing you didn't stare at in case it ran away. By God's help, she said, not as a consolation but as an arrangement. We will be at the burnt gum stump with the lantern as agreed. 1 long, 2 short. Mr. Reeves will guide from there to the farm beyond Meadow Bridge. That bridge holds soldiers, Lemuel said. Only sometimes, she said, and the smile at the corner of her mouth looked like a woman making peace with rain. But the Lord keeps a spare path in his pocket. Go safe. He pushed off, the skiff yawing and then aligning with the flow. In the afternoon, Ransom came down to the yard, sleeves rolled to show he had a notion of work, riding crop tucked like an opinion. He stood in the mouth of the cooper's shed with a shadow bigger than he was, watching Lemuel bind a hoop. The air held the resin tang of pine and the sour of old molasses. Thorne, Ransom said, dropping his name like a chip to a dog, as he had taken to doing with older men when he learned they did not answer to boy. Your work carries. My father says the Newport News traders fight for your tightness. I like a man whose product doesn't leak. Lemuel pinched the hoop with both hands fine and set it in place. Yes, sir. Overseer tells me you know the river. I know where it don't like strangers, Lemuel said, polite as a blank page. Ransom laughed. He liked to take a man's words and fit them on himself as if they were clothes. You're to take me out tomorrow, he said. Show me where the nightmen run. I aim to stop leaks that are bigger than barrels. Lemuel kept the shave against the wood. He made himself hear only the word tomorrow because the others tried too hard to be bigger than they were. Yes, sir. Ransom tilted, amused. He tapped the stave with his crop. I like you, Thorne, he said in a tone that did not promise any kind of favor. You tell the truth in a way that makes a man feel clever. He paused, then, and tipped his head, studying Lemuel's face like a man trying to place a tune he'd heard as a child. He might have said something else, but Ferris called him, and when Ferris called, Ransom still answered. Night gathered with gnats and gossip. Jacob slipped under the shed lean-to with a handful of river glass he swore was lucky and a story about a dog that swam like it had a purpose. Dinah passed with a basket and eyes that asked what mouths could not. In the quarters, someone mended a shirt and someone else mended a spirit with a song that rockered slow, holding notes as if they were infants. Lemuel took his bread to the pallet, turned his body toward the wall, and slid the tiny stub of pencil from inside the hem of his trousers. He laid the bread flat, cut it silently, took the scrap from its seam, and, shielding the marks with his hand, wrote. Dinah plus boy equals ready. Hail fever better. Jacob brave, too much. Old Cuff cough worse. Ferry, drift pole by eel ditch. Ransom wants tomorrow. Make him look wrong way. He blew on the words as if they needed cooling. The candle on the sill gave one pearl of smoke as a moth found it and repented. Lemuel palmed the paper back under the hem. He chewed the crust with his back teeth and made himself taste it, earth, sugar forgotten by a bee, the patience of wheat. Sleep came like a hound that pretends you called it. The next day announced itself with a storm's promise and then reconsidered. Clouds dragged their feet over the pine but did nothing mentionable. Ransom arrived at the river in a coat too fine for Bankside and boots that had never swung easy from a skiff. He carried a pistol as if it were a word he had just learned to use in company. Show me where they like to run, he said, as if he had asked for lemonade. Lemuel nodded and pushed off. Ransom went to sit and changed his mind twice. The skiff answered to the current like a good dog. They moved into the lacework of sloughs where cypress roots knitted their secrets. Lemuel told the truth where truth was useless and kept quiet where quiet was the only thing that served. "You ever think about leaving, Thorn?" Ransom asked after an hour, voice bright with a kind of curiosity men sometimes mistake for kindness. Lemuel looked at the water. "I think about the river," he said. Ransom smiled without heat. "You're clever," he said, admiring the trick more than the man. "Clever makes slaves dangerous." He said it like he liked being near a burning barn so long as it was not his own. They glided under a sycamore whose roots made a cathedral for fish. Lemuel pretended to avoid the path he needed, and in the pretense laid his track. He pointed with his chin toward a sandbar where he knew ferrymen sometimes rested on long nights. "They put their feet there," he said. "Only fools leave footprints." Ransom followed his chin with his eyes and filed the lie as a truth. Lemuel let the skiff overshoot a little, then fended off and let the current carry them toward a dead gum with a scar along its belly, where the water went shallow and the mud would keep a secret if asked nicely. "Here," he said, giving Ransom something to believe. "See where the cane lays down like it's been making a bed? They drag there. You can set men with lanterns, a long and two short, and catch a turtle if you're hungry." Ransom grinned. "We'll set it tonight," he said, pleased as a boy who thought of the trick himself. He had not asked why a lantern would signal anything in a swamp. He did not yet know that many men arranged their faith around the idea that their thoughts began in their own heads. By noon, Ransom had tired of pretending to be patient. He ordered Lemuel back to the yard with a wave, then rode off to tell Ferris to put men at the cane bed after dark. Lemuel watched him go until the pines were only rumor. Then he pulled upriver to the eel ditch, a sliver of water barely wide as a man's shoulders, and slid the skiff into it with the slowness of a man laying down a heavy grief. Tempe Howell waited under the burnt gum stump as promised, bonnet shadowing eyes that did not waste their time on fear today. Behind her, Mr. Reeves, tall, gaunt, with the stillness of a man who, once he makes a decision, sees it through like a season, held the reins of two mules that knew more than their owners liked to admit. There were others, faces Lemuel had learned not to memorize, names only for the night, people whose lives would vanish from this place like a sandpiper's footstep when the next tide breathed in. "Tonight," Lemuel said. "Cane bed east of the sycamore. Lantern sign will throw hounds in the wrong notch. Ferris will watch the wrong dark." Tempe's mouth softened around the thought. "You plan like a river," she said. "With patience. We will be where they are not." Lemuel gave her the small nod that meant, trust, but count your steps. He laid the plan out in small, chewable pieces. Dinah and her boy Hale would come by the ash row when the horn blew for supper. Jacob would stumble and drop a pail, drawing Ferris's eye. Old Cuff, who had lived long enough to be considered useless to a prophet, would sing the slow song he only sang when something was about to happen. Lemuel would load an extra barrel, not on any list, and no one would notice because men who count often forget to look. They would slide into the eel ditch at moonrise. 2 lanterns would bloom beyond the burnt gum, one would die, the other would promise a way forward. Tempe reached for his hand and did not take it, instead she touched the stave scar on the barrel he had brought last week, as if the wood held a relic. "It will cost you," she said plainly. "Perhaps not tonight. But it will cost you." Lemuel thought of his mother's voice, of the time she said a bad river feeds itself. He thought of Ransom's jaw, a rhyme his face made with Lemuel's own. He thought of the way a boy will always look for the father's approval in a room that has no father in it. He said, "Everything does." They parted before the sun thought about folding itself, because men who plan with patience do not waste it. The big house ate light and returned shadows. Lemuel's place in the yard did not change until it was time for it to change. He shaved staves and answered to his name and took the small thrashings men offered him, words, looks, the extra weight added to a task as if to see where he might bend. When the horn went for supper, he set his tools exactly where they belonged so that anyone looking would see the story he intended to show. here is a man who does not keep secrets large enough to trip over. In the quarters, dinner smelled of greens cut sugar thin and a bone boiled past remembering. Hale coughed and then did not, because Jacob made a face at him that made the boy forget to cough. Dinah's hands shook when she wiped his mouth. Old Cuff hummed his song of a train that had no rails and still found its station. Lemuel sat with his back to the door as if to rest. He waited for the moment when the yard's attention turned, when the dogs yawned and men thought of pipes. Then he stood and said, "Come." They went under the wash line and past the ash row. Jacob knocked his pail over so expertly he ought to have been paid. Ferris cussed with the artistry of a man who had rehearsed and looked away to blame someone who was not there. Lemuel courted the dark lightly. He carried the extra barrel on his shoulder as if it weighed less than what it held. Dinah walked as if walking were newly invented and no one had ruined it yet. At the river, the world opened into a silence that sounded like the word possible. Lemuel loaded the barrel and set Dinah's hand on the rim. Hale's eyes were a moon. He lifted the child and slid him down into darkness that smelled of oak and a life other than this. He gave him the cord end to worry. "Bite it if you must," he whispered. "It will hold your teeth and all the words you ain't said yet." Dinah climbed into the space behind, knees to her chest, breaths counted. Lemuel set the false bottom, set the lid, set his patience like a lid on himself. Jacob stood on the bank like a stalk that did not see the wind. He held the pole while Lemuel stepped in and took it. "Tell Cuff to sing," Lemuel whispered. Jacob nodded and went, shoulders saying what mouths must not. The skiff took the water. The eel ditch opened its frail throat and let them in because Lemuel, over years, had paid soil and root the respect owed by anyone who asked passage. One lantern lit, then snuffed. Another held. The burnt gum stump kept its counsel. Mr. Reeves's mules stamped to make the mosquitoes reconsider. Lemuel pulled, and the river remembered him. Behind them, on the wrong slough, Ransom Bellamy and Ferris sat men with lanterns at the cane bed. They held dogs on leashes and opinions in their mouths. Ransom told a story in which he would be large by sunrise. Ferris kept his eyes on the water and noticed the way it moved different because a wind had shifted 2 hours ago. He said nothing. Lemuel reached the stump. Tempe Howell didn't speak. She simply put her hand on the skiff's gunwale, permission, blessing, receipt. The barrel slid to the bank with a grunt that sounded like nothing at all. Hands, Mr. Reeves's, and another pair, small and sure, lifted it and vanished it into cane. Dinah's body would uncramp in 20 minutes, Hale would ask for water and be given a bit of lemon to make his mouth wet without sound. They would walk a path only their feet needed to know and sleep in a barn that had not been told its purpose yet. Lemuel took the empty skiff back the way he had come, pushing against the tide of his own fear until it thinned enough to drink. He entered the yard with the blank face he wore when the world wanted to see itself reflected in him. Ransom did not return until near dawn, anger tired around the edges. He dismounted, spattered with swamp and annoyed to be spattered with anything. He looked at Lemuel and saw only a cooper who had splinters in his thumb. "You led us wrong," he said, less accusation than disappointment that reality had not aligned with him. "The cane bed will be good another night," Lemuel said, neutral as rain. Ransom studied him. Something hungry flickered. He opened his mouth and closed it. Then he smiled with his teeth. "Tomorrow," he said as if the word had been invented to comfort men like him. "Tomorrow we set 2 traps." Tomorrow arrived with a letter. Lemuel was sweeping sawdust when Mrs. Annalise, thin as a new moon, nerves dressed in silk, sent a kitchen girl to fetch him. He wiped his hands and climbed the back steps to the porch where the air tried to pretend it was cooler, because money had told it to. Mrs. sat with a glass of lemonade she didn't drink and a letter held by tongs as if it might stain her. Her hair was the color of straw overripe, and it did not move in the heat. She gestured with her chin to a side table. "Read," she said. "Ferris says you can." She said it like she meant, "You will do what I cannot and then forget." Lemuel lifted the letter. The seal had been broken clumsily, not by her. He knew Ferris's hands, he recognized the rip as he recognized a river bend. He let his eyes walk the lines, moving like a man who cannot be caught because no one knows he has left yet. Richmond, May the 8th, 1860. Sir, your remittance is overdue in the matter of account for Negro hire to be McKendry and Sons. Further, it is rumored among parties of trade that your son has spoken injudiciously regarding the shipment south of certain persons held for sale. We caution discretion. There was more. Lemuel read it all and knew two things: debts had tightened their hands on this house, and Ransom had a mouth that outran him. He folded the letter exactly as it had arrived and set it down. Well? Mrs. Annalise asked, not looking at him. Merchants want their money, Lemuel said. They warn about talk. She flinched as if he had thrown the words. Her hand tightened on the tongs. You didn't read it, she said quickly, because sometimes lies must be offered room to stand. Get Ferris. He went, and as he went, he used the letter once more for himself and for those whose names could be written only at night. Ransom's talk about shipment south meant he would need money soon. Money meant men seized at docks, men sent to traders to be marched to Orleans. Which meant Lemuel's planning must grow teeth. That night, 3 men and a woman slipped through the eel ditch, joined by a boy who would not leave Jacob's shadow until Jacob took him by the scruff like a pup and thrust him into safety. Ferris's trap at the cane bed caught a possum fat with figs and a man whose fear made him run after the dogs instead of away, so that when they caught him, he threw his hands up and kissed the ground as if to say he had set out only to return. Ransom laughed and patted himself on the back in a mirror no one else could see. On the 3rd day, old Cuff's cough found a new note, and Lemuel felt a thread go tight. Cuff had outlived 3 owners in a war that had not started yet. He had taught Lemuel to listen to trees for weather and to women for the truth men often forgot to tell. He beckoned Lemuel near and said, when a man with your blood smiles at you like a cat, he always means the same thing. Which thing? Lemuel asked, keeping his voice a stone dropped into a well. He means to think he's the only one who knows you two share a face, Cuff said, with a laugh that rattled. He don't. The trees know. The river knew before your mama did. Lemuel looked at the rafters long enough to make his eyes dry. Tonight, he said. And then more nights. Until the river's mouth remembers our names. Cuff nodded and began his song as if agreeing with the weather. From Richmond came stories that any man could pick off the breeze, talk about the election, about Mr. Lincoln's name spoken with fear or hope, about South Carolina's men behaving like a match near lamp oil. Those stories ran ahead of themselves. Lemuel stored them in a room with no windows and concentrated on how a barrel should not leak and a plan should not either. He set about the hardest part then, the part that made men say the word betrayal as if it were a brand new blade. He would take Ransom Bellamy by the hand and lead him to a place where the Underground Railroad, a name that made Mrs. Annalise cross herself, would grasp him. Not to harm him beyond repair, and not to save him either, but to make of him a message. Ransom would be handing men to traders for Orleans. Lemuel would hand Ransom to a night full of people who did not make room for cruelty to pass unremarked. They would strip him of dogs and power for one night, they would send him back naked of certainty. And then they would wait to see what he chose to do with the part of himself Lemuel had not stolen. This required a net of small lies and one large truth. The small lies would be about lanterns and footpaths. The large truth would be one Ransom would not believe until it chose him. He went to the shed and cleaned the drawknife until he could see his face in its back. He did not look long. He steamed a stave bent enough to make the faintest creak, the sound wood makes when it changes its mind. He thought of how much a man could alter his course for the sake of someone else's life. He thought of his mother's last look at him, a look that had wanted to leave him something he could use and had settled for leaving him herself. At dusk, he took Ransom to the river. He did not wait to be asked. Sir, he said, respectful as a bow, I seen tracks where the slough bends at Cypress Chin. I know a way to lay for them without wetting boots. Ransom's eyes quickened the way a fire takes when you give it the smallest whisper. Ferris says the east path is best. Ferris's eyes ain't got cypress pupils, Lemuel said, giving Ransom the kind of flattery he believed was born of his own judgment. You want to stop a leak right, you fix it where the barrel thinks it ain't leaking. Ransom liked that. He always liked a picture that let him pretend he already owned the thing depicted. They set out at moonrise. Ferris followed behind with 2 men holding lanterns and a boy with a horn he was forbidden to blow until told. The dogs, relieved to be in a world that made sense, strained at their leashes and told the night what it already knew. Lemuel pulled them into a darkness he had courted enough to be sure of. He steered toward Cypress Chin, a curve where an ancient tree jutted like a jaw and the water dropped away sharp, then shallowed into a bed of eelgrass. This was a place where a man could vanish 3 ways, into mud, into water, or into trees. It was also a place where a woman in a bonnet and a man with hands like fence posts could place themselves between a boy and the man he would one day be. Lantern, long, then too short, glowed and died among the trees like faith signaling itself. To Ferris, it would read as quarry. To Ransom, it would shine like proof that he had been right to have Lemuel brought. To Lemuel, it did not say anything at all, it only breathed. "Hold," Lemuel said softly, and because he hardly ever gave an order, men obeyed. A figure stepped from the trees, Mr. Reeves, and another, Tempe Howell, her bonnet caught by moon. Behind them, the suggestion of more people in the deep of the trees, no more seen than a promise is seen. They were unarmed in any way a child could describe, but the night had its purposes. Reeves lifted his hand, palm out, the sign a ferryman gives to another when he means to take cargo. "Who are you?" Ransom demanded, voice trying for a register it did not own. He drew his pistol and found it heavy as new knowledge. "No one you can sell," Reeves said, and his voice had the iron that comes from picking few words well. Ferris stepped to Ransom's shoulder, calculated the odds, and decided to be clever later. The dogs whined because the air had changed and they did not know what to do with that. Tempe's eyes found Lemuel's and passed over him like a hand on a child's brow. She addressed Ransom with the courtesy of a woman who has learned to hand men the dignity they refuse to fetch for themselves. "Sir," she said evenly, "we are here for what does not belong to you. We leave you intact. If you raise the pistol, we will still leave you intact, but you will hear a sound in your ears for the rest of your life that you cannot find in any room, your own cowardice, speaking plain." Ransom laughed, but the laugh looked like a boy stepping into water colder than he planned. He raised the pistol because that is what boys do when they dream of being men. Lemuel moved the skiff between Ransom and the trees with the naturalness with which a man steps between a candle and wind to save light. "Don't," Lemuel said, the word a thing carved, oiled, useful. Ransom glanced at him, surprise hot. "You think you can tell me?" Ferris shifted, signal in his shoulder. The boy with the horn licked his lips. From the dark came a rustle like 1,000 birds thinking at once. Figures stepped wider around. A rope fell over the muzzle of Ransom's pistol and jerked. Another rope took the pistol's hand. Reeves was near before anyone counted the steps. He took the weapon like a man retrieves a foolish child from a riverbank. Ransom made a sound that had not yet decided whether it was fear or fury. Ferris did not move because he had already used up his allotment of bad decisions for the night. Tempe stood like a thing planted in the first good rain after a dry spell. "We will take 3, she said, eyes traveling not to Ransom but to the trees where people breathed shallow. "We will take them now and then count ourselves blessed. If you call men, they will come to the cane bed and catch nothing because the river does not favor those who swear at it." "Who are you to?" Ransom started, and then he stopped because the sound Tempe promised had arrived in his ears before its time. He stood stunned by his own listening. Hands brushed past Lemuel, the briefest touches, human and necessary, as people slid through shadow and into the skiff, into the second boat that had been nothing moments ago and now was a way out. Lemuel kept the pole firm. He did not allow himself to count faces. "Send me your father's dogs tomorrow," Reeves said, voice so quiet it might have been a note in a hymn. "They do not fetch what you think they fetch." Lemuel took breath, filled his ribs with it until they thought better of being a cage. He pulled. The skiff backed into the dark the way a thought retreats to kneel before returning his action. Behind him, Ransom stood on a bank he had not expected to defend with only his mouth. Ferris finally remembered to breathe. They slipped away, and the river kept their secret the way a mother keeps a child's. The boats flowed into eelgrass, the lantern at the stump went out as if sleep had finally won. Lemuel's shoulders burned, good and honest. He listened for a shot that did not come and then for a horn that would be too late if it sounded. Only frogs and one lonesome heron spoke. At the quarters, Jacob waited with eyes like two new pennies. "Done?" he asked, and Lemuel knew the boy would ask that after every night until the last night. "Done for now," Lemuel said, and he put his hand on Jacob's head, a thing he had not done since the boy turned 13 and thought himself past it. Before dawn, Ransom appeared at the shed door like a man who had almost been born and changed his mind. He stared at Lemuel and saw something he had not noticed before, perhaps the line of jaw that made a rhyme. Perhaps nothing at all. He reached into his coat and pulled out the letter from Richmond as if to provide proof of something. He held it out and then took it back, edges trembling. "Tomorrow," he said again, foolish as a man who tries to make the same road lead to a different town by insisting on it. Lemuel nodded as if Ransom had suggested weather. He worked the day long inside a quiet that felt like a half-healed cut. He made barrels and he made plans. He placed, under the floorboard near his pallet, a second ledger, not paper, but a string of small objects threaded on twine, not for a person, bead for a night, nail for a turn in the river, sliver of bone for a song sung to distract a child. He touched each in order and prayed without using any of the words a man uses in church. He did this not because he feared forgetting, but because he feared God might, unless reminded, overlook the small braveries men perform in corners. The blow came when the day had already folded itself. Ferris, eyes narrowed to make room for suspicion, lifted the lid of an empty barrel at the wrong moment and found the double bottom. He stared at the space as if it had spoken his name. He said nothing. He closed the barrel. He walked away. A man can choose the time he spends with a secret. Ferris took his to Ransom at midnight. They came to Lemuel's shed together, the son with a smile he could not keep even if he wanted, the overseer with a quiet he thought would save him. They stepped inside, and the scent of sap rose to greet them like a faithful hound that does not know it might be kicking dirt on its own grave. "Thorn," Ransom said softly. "Show me your bottom." He meant the barrels. His laugh came too quick to hide the fear he had acquired near Cypress' chin. Lemuel turned the barrel with its cork scar. He lifted the lid without flinch. He did not glance at the false, because glancing is how a man teaches his enemy how to watch him. He moved like a man who has decided the world will end today or else go on barely altered. Ferris bent and put 2 fingers to the joint. He found the seam. Ransom's breath hissed as if he had been answered by a cobra. He straightened, pistol drawn with reluctance, as if it were a debt he now had to pay. "Tell me," Ransom said, and the softness was gone. "Tell me who you are." Lemuel lifted his eyes, the deep well he had kept covered with a board for years. He saw the jawline that would not quit. He saw the mouth that would never quite be a man's because the boy it had been refused to be told where to go. He said, "I'm the one who knows the river better than you know your own self." Ransom's hand shook, and the pistol turned that shake into noise. He steadied, and for the first time in his life, did not smile. "Tonight," he said, mouth hard. "You take me to them." He lifted his chin, daring his words to be true. "Or I kill Jacob and cuff and the woman with the boy who coughed." Ferris flinched because sometimes a man's line is drawn for him, and it surprises him where it lies. Lemuel took a breath that found the bottom of him. He let it out as if laying down a plank. "Then I'll take you," he said. "But you'll go in my skiff, and you won't bring Ferris." He paused, "Let the small truth be a gift. You will not need him where you are bound." Ransom weighed the pistol in the night. He was clever enough to think this might be victory again, for once. He jerked his chin at Ferris. "Hold back. If I'm not back by dawn, call the county." Ferris opened his mouth, shut it, counted his future, and nodded. Ransom followed Lemuel to the bank where the river waited like a woman who had already decided what answer she would give. He stepped into the skiff with care, and his courage looked beautiful for the brief moment it existed. Lemuel set the pole and felt the old current take hold of him as if he had finally said yes to his own life. The sloughs opened. Cypress chin made its jaw. Lantern long, too short, appeared and disappeared as agreed. Ransom stood, pistol still in his hand but lowered, as if he meant to be courteous to fate. From the trees came a rustle, not of birds but of people learning how to fly with their feet on the ground. A shape resolved, Mr. Reeves first, then Tempe Howell, then a dozen shadows becoming more. The river lay under them like a truth that wanted telling. Now, Lemuel said to Ransom, voice level as the water when wind holds its breath. Now you will learn the other side of a boat. Ransom blinked once, and in that blink, the skiff kissed a root and rocked. He shifted his weight as a man does when he has never built a thing with his own hands and yet wishes the world to balance for him. Set the gun down, Reeves said, not as a command but as a suggestion any wise man would take. And step out. No harm, if you let this night do what it came for. Ransom's mouth opened to form a word that would have been either no or never. It did not finish it, because from the dark behind them, on the bank they had just left, someone else moved, a body small and desperate, Jacob's shape with fear draped over it like a wet cloak. He had followed, because boys do, because loyalty is a wild dog that will not be penned. Ransom saw him and smiled the smile of a boy who has been granted a bonus prize. Change of plan, he said, raising the pistol toward the bank where Jacob stood in the thin wash of moon. Lemuel moved without thinking the way a man moves when the last board has to be laid true, or the house falls. He lifted the pole, shoved the skiff sideways hard, and the world tilted. Water took the tilt and made it law. Ransom staggered, the pistol jerked skyward, a shot cracked like a ship's spar in a gale, and something heavy thumped the gunwale. The lantern on the far bank answered with its agreed rhythm, one long, two short, and men in the trees drew breath as if about to speak. The skiff spun in a slow circle that felt like a sentence trying to find its verb. Ransom looked at Lemuel with a face that had just learned a new word, brother. His mouth moved. The pistol slipped from his hand and struck wood with a slap that announced itself. Don't move, Reeves said, voice low and urgent and near. Tempe lifted her hands as if to hold back the night itself. On the bank, Jacob froze, the wet shine on his cheeks making moons of his eyes. Lemuel set the pole again, and the skiff groaned, in. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. And, the skiff groaned, and the river tipped its palm as if weighing two lives. Lemuel sank the pole deep, feeling for bottom the way a man feels for the right word. The iron ferrule bit mud, he heaved, swinging the bow away from Jacob and toward the lantern sign. Water licked the gunwale and slapped Ransom's boots. The pistol clattered, spun once, and slid into the eelgrass with a small, satisfied sigh. Hold your breath, Lemuel said to the night, which obeyed. Jacob flinched back into shadow, hands limp at his sides as if he had been caught taking too much light. From the trees, Mr. Reeves surged to the margin, broad palms open. Bring him, Reeves said without heat. No blood if no one insists on it. Tempe Howell stood one pace behind, bonnet brimming moon. Her stare went from Lemuel to Ransom the way a midwife measures a coming life for danger and passage. Lemuel slid the skiff alongside the cypress roots and, in the same movement, closed his fingers around Ransom's sleeve. Not rough, just enough to settle the world into this path, not any other. He felt the young man's arm tense like a rope pulled wrong. Ransom jerked once, more out of habit than intent. Lemuel said low, if you run, you drown. If you shoot, you drown. If you shout, you bring dogs from the wrong bend and a bullet finds Jacob. Choose the path that keeps breath in your mouth. Ransom's reply hitched. He looked past Lemuel, toward the bank where Jacob had been. He did not see the boy now. Reeves had shifted him with a hand on the shoulder, easy as moving a sapling from frost, but the opportunity to hurt had been taken and filed by the river itself. The night offered Ransom nothing to strike. Step, Tempe said, voice like a plank laid across a gap. Now. Ransom stepped. His boot found the root. Lemuel's hand did not leave his sleeve until two more steps set him among the trees. Reeves took the other arm. Between them, Ransom stood suddenly smaller, as if a room he'd always owned had been let unfurnished. We are not your enemies, Tempe said. We are also not your servants. She looked at Lemuel, not seeking permission, seeking agreement between people who already knew the cost of it. A night's work is waiting. They moved inland, off the slick bank and onto ground that gave back a little, then steadied. Pines lifted themselves like hymns. The path was not a path, it was a decision repeated by quiet feet over years. Ransom stumbled once, steadied by Reeves before he could turn the stumble into a performance. Lemuel came behind, pole now shoulder high, a staff instead of a tool, without menace, with purpose. At the burnt gum stump, a small congregation waited in darkness so complete it felt chosen. 2 women with baskets that did not hold bread. A narrow man with a scar like an equal's sign under his eye. The smell of mule and tallow. No voices, only the creak of leather and the wet whisper of someone trying not to cough. Ransom's breath sounded like a child's nose in winter, willing, stubborn, astonished by its own labor. We heard you, Mr. Thorne, Reeves said softly. We heard the pole sing. Lemuel nodded once. Ferris holds back at the West Cane. He will not come here unless the swamp tells him a lie. It has told him worse, Tempe said, then to the gathered ones, we take the turn behind Meadow Bridge. 2 miles by creek. Then the long field with the old locusts. Mr. Reeves's cousin will fetch you in a wagon that looks like 2 sacks of potatoes tied to regret. No torches, no talk. She stepped close to Ransom. You will walk in the middle, she told him, between 2 people who do not need to like you to keep you alive tonight. Ransom's jaw jutted, then wavered, like a cup set on a table that isn't level. Where do you take me? He asked, and the question came out lighter than he intended, floated, almost polite. To understanding, Tempe said. They began. For a time, the forest took even the idea of time. The creek gurgled to its own amazement. The mules huffed mist. Lemuel felt the map he kept in his ribs unroll, hollows, hummocks, places where roots knuckled out of the black, places where you do not put your foot when men with guns are behind you. He did not look at Ransom except to make sure he was still there, living, useful to the lesson the night insisted on giving. At Meadow Bridge, a wide slash of planks over water sulking toward the Pamunkey, Tempe lifted her hand. They waited, 3 deep breaths, 4. A wagon appeared as if born of a fog that had not existed until it was needed. The driver, Reeves's cousin, if blood could be inferred from the way he didn't waste syllables, clucked his tongue so soft it almost sounded like prayer. Inside, he said. There's burlap if he complains. He meant Ransom. Ransom did not complain then. He climbed into the wagon as if climbing into a sentence he didn't write. Lemuel settled on the tail, boots hanging. Tempe took the front seat, bonnet forward, a woman going to market for turnips no one particularly wanted. The wagon rumbled. Not fast. Not slow. The speed of something that has changed its mind without announcing it. They crossed fields that carried the ghost of tobacco and the hunger that crop leaves behind. They slid past a fence so straight it bent the road around its opinion. A dog barked twice and then remembered its own sleep. A man at a yard gate scratched himself and watched the wagon pass with the particular curiosity of someone who hopes the world will deliver surprise right to his fence post. It did not. At the Howell farm, a white house that had decided comfort was not a sin, with shutters that wished to look blue in daylight, Tempe rose. The wagon turned its wheels into the lane and hid itself behind a stand of Osage orange. A barn door sighed open. Light like warm butter fell out, then dimmed at Tempe's gesture. Inside, the smell of hay and old apples and irons settled over the moving bodies like an extra blanket. Down, Reeves said to Ransom. Hands where I can see them. Ransom obeyed with a stiffness that suggested a boy trained to pretend at compliance whenever grown men took to lectures. Lemuel watched him with the same attention he would give a barrel column swelling on a humid day, trying to see, in the line and the grain, whether it would hold. Tempe set a lantern upon an upturned crate and lifted the hood only enough to show faces. She stood by it, neither host nor judge, a keeper of necessary light. Reeves faced Ransom square. You are coming to sell 3 more this week, he said. It was a line, not a question. Ransom set his mouth. My father's debts are his business. Mine is the estate's health. The words sounded borrowed and too big for him, like a coat a cousin outgrew. Negroes are property, he added, dull and dutiful. Tempe's head tipped. Property that learns letters, she said, and bleeds like you. Ransom's eyes slid, almost despite himself, to Lemuel. The lantern carved Lemuel's face into lines he recognized from the river, the shape of a bank that had stayed what it was by yielding when it must. Ransom looked away. Reeves said, You will write a letter to your father tonight. You will say you are delayed. You will say a fever kept you. You will say nothing of us. Ransom laughed then, a little hiccup of self returning. You think you can keep me? You think, he stopped because Reeves had moved without moving, the distance between them shortened by certainty alone. We will not hurt you, Reeves said. We will also not let you undo the work of 10 winters because pride answers to no one in your house. You will stay until sunrise. You will see what we do with the night you meant to use for catching. Tempe set a tin plate before him, cold biscuit, salted apple slices, a wedge of cheese. Eat, she said. Men speak clearer when their blood has something to do besides remember itself. Ransom did not touch the food for a minute. Then he did, as if appetite were an admission he could manage. He chewed without tasting and swallowed like a man untying a knot. Lemuel sank to a hay bale at the wall and kept his hands on his knees the way he did when listening to a story he should not be heard understanding. He watched the barn door, in, out, in again. People came and went like answers. A mother with a baby whose eyes reflected the lamp as if cradling 2 sons. An old man with a gait that would not change for anyone's impatience. A teenager whose anger smelled like iron but whose hands were steady when it came time to lift someone into the wagon hidden beyond the corner of the yard. All the while, the house slept on its own knowledge, a house accustomed to dissent disguised as quilting and prayer. At some hour that did not belong to either night or day, Tempe placed before Ransom a scrap of paper, a stub of pencil, an ink bottle only half alive. Right, she said. Tell your father you chase a rumor to the east and you will return when you have wrung it out. Say you will visit Mr. McKendry, he owes you a debt. He will feel flattered enough by your attention to keep his tongue. Ransom took the pencil as if it were a snake he had decided to charm. His first letters were too big, his hand remembered itself and wrote smaller. He formed the words from training and from fear. Lemuel watched the slope of Ransom's script, the tilt toward his name, the impatience of his vowels. Ransom signed with a flourish he did not deserve, then paused as if tempted to add something true. He did not. It will do, Tempe said, taking the paper as if taking a burden. She pressed sand upon the ink and blew softly, a woman extinguishing a candle that had no business burning so long. A low thud outside. Reeves went to the shadow and returned with a man leaning hard on his shoulder. The man's shirt had been made to fit someone else and then made to fit fear. He lowered himself to the hay as if asking permission from the floor. Eyes closed, he smiled when the baby fussed, because babies remind the living they are allowed to stay. Tempe bent and felt along his ribs, fingers gentle as a thought you cannot afford to lose. Ransom watched every motion with hunger he would not name. You break laws, he said finally, not as accusation but as an observation leveled against the weight of what he had seen these 2 hours. Tempe straightened. Some laws break God, she answered. Silence drew itself up. The barn breathed. Lemuel let his own breath settle into that great chest. He thought about tomorrow, the one that existed whether a man acknowledged it or not. He thought about Ferris lurking like a splinter, about Mrs. Annalise's lemon and letters, about old Cuff's cough, drawing thick now, hard to pull through, about Dinah thanking a doorframe for being sturdy enough to lean on while she learned a new word for road. At the lip of black morning, Reeves's cousin returned with the wagon empty and a face that meant this round had not failed. Westfield Farm took them, he murmured to Tempe, and his word took held the 1,000 smaller words it needed not to say. Captain Blaylock's boy asked me if potatoes like Dawn. He smiled once, briefly, the kind of smile a man offers a wall when he recognizes in it a fellow laborer. Tempe turned to Ransom. "Sunrise," she said. "You go home and pretend last night replaced nothing in you. Or, if you prefer, you can become a man." Ransom flinched. His eyes had adjusted to the barn's truth and now seemed wronged by the prospect of daylight. He glanced at Lemuel, not to ask for counsel, just to see if the face there agreed with or condemned him. Lemuel left him nothing to read but patience. They took Ransom back the way they had come, only slower, as if the ground would forget a man who hurried. When the skiff nosed up to the Belfield bank, the east was a pallor learning speech. Ferris waited under a tupelo, expression the color of water when it remembers a drowned thing. He said nothing when he saw Ransom. He looked at Lemuel and counted something he would add to later. Ransom climbed out, shook his sleeves as if shaking off burrs, rolled his neck, and found a smile that did not rise above his teeth. He looked at Ferris. "They used the elk path," he lied. "We were near them the whole night." Ferris, relief and insult disputing his forehead, nodded with the care of a man laying cards face down. "We'll set at the elk path then," he said evenly, and like that, the false map had another devoted reader. His eyes returned to Lemuel. "Cooper," he said, letting the word do the work of "I will lay for you another night." Lemuel went to the shed like any man who had earned an hour's work before breakfast. He bent to the shave, drew long, perfect ribbons from oak, and allowed the day to consider itself ordinary if it wished. For 3 nights, the work multiplied. Mrs. Howell's barn became a hinge upon which entire lives swung to new doorways. Reeves's cousin wore a trail between safe farms and the moving idea of safety itself. Lemuel's barrels offered their false bottoms to fear and their true hoops to the thirsty world of trade. Ferris's snares collected only mosquitoes and a raccoon that took offense and left without apology. But the river, generous as it can be, does not hide a man forever from the eyes in his own yard. Old Cuff's cough soured, then softened, the soft that comes when the body loses interest in the argument it is, just as the soul grows more sure. Lemuel settled beside him one evening and offered the old man the last of a jar's molasses. Cuff licked the spoon and smacked his lips with ceremony. "You set a boy in a boat," he rasped, "and he learns river words the ground never taught him." "You watching from here?" Lemuel asked, half a smile. "I watch from wherever I ain't supposed to," Cuff croaked. "I seen your father smile when he was 18. Same wrong thing in it as that boy's smile got now." He shut his eyes as if to see better. "Don't confuse blood with river water, Lem. Blood runs only one way, and it don't teach you how to choose. River runs all ways and demands you choose every minute." Lemuel bowed his head briefly to Cuff's sermon. "I'm choosing," he said. "I am also paying." "Ain't no bargain without cost," Cuff said, then coughed a laugh. "Take him again. Take him farther. Don't kill him. That ain't our work. But take him to where he knows he can't swim alone." The chance came stamped with the world's particular mess. Mrs. Annalise sent for Lemuel with another letter, this one somehow primer and more desperate at once. Debts had refused to be charmed by Manners. Orland's traders promised impossible sums for prime lots. The page reeked of a broker's ink and the sweat of men who made their money by counting other men's bones. "Read," she said, and Lemuel read, and he understood that Ransom's tipping point had been reached. He would either grasp for the most cruel lever available or drop his hand in shame. He doubted shame would win. That night, Lemuel placed the double-bottom barrel in the skiff and did not put anyone inside it. He tucked into the space a single iron shackle, one he had unearthed at the far end of the old whipping post a winter ago and hidden because iron like that is memory, and sometimes memory, used right, is medicine. When Ransom came, because Ransom always came when his story demanded he be its hero, Lemuel did not wait for the boy's instructions. "There's a rumor," he said softly. "A trail farther east. You'll want to see it before Ferris ruins it with his feet." Ransom blinked, put his pride back on like a hat, and nodded. "Lead," he said. They glided. Cicadas sawed at the night until the night tuned itself. Lemuel did not steer toward Cypress Chin, nor toward the burnt stump, but beyond, to a black gut of river that most men avoided because it had decided it did not need them. There, in a pocket of trees that grew at rude angles and a mat of lily pads that pretended to be land, Lemuel set the pole and held the skiff steady. "Listen," he said. Ransom listened. Nothing but frogs in his own breath. Then, another sound, the far creak of harness, the thud of hooves, not toward them, but parallel. The underground had learned to run sideways when men expected straight lines. "You can call now," Lemuel said in a tone that could be taken for invitation or challenge. "Blow your horn. Bring Ferris. Catch your prize." He held Ransom's eye. "Or you can see another way a night can be used." Ransom's nostrils flared with the remembered spice of praise he imagined for himself. He put his hand on the horn at his belt and then took it away as if the brass had heated under his palm. "Show me," he said harshly, confused by the very word "show" leaving his own mouth. Lemuel nodded toward the barrel. He lifted the lid and let the shackle shine once in the slit of starlight. Ransom recoiled. "What?" "I want you to carry that," Lemuel said evenly. "For 1 hour. No man will fasten it to you. You will put it on your own shoulders and hold it there. You will feel what it weighs in the dark. And you will look at nothing but your feet and the place you put them. At the end, whoever you are will be more honest than now. I need you honest once in your life." Ransom's laugh cracked, a boy's voice trying to shoe itself in a man's boot. "You presume." "I live," Lemuel said simply. "So I presume." He handed Ransom the iron. It was not heavy enough to break a back, not light enough to be mistaken for anything else. Ransom took it with both hands like a man accepting a thing unwrapped in public. He cursed, softly, at the pure rude weight. Lemuel did not flinch from the curse, any more than the river flinched from the moon. They stepped onto the muddy lip. Lemuel led, staff probing, feet remembering. Ransom followed with the shackle braced on his collarbones, breath short and noisy, pride no longer useful even as ornament. They went a quarter mile, half, and every step recalibrated some gauge Ransom had used his whole life to measure others. At last, in a blind pocket where water sighed like an old woman resigning something, Lemuel stopped. "Put it down," he said. "Just there." Ransom lowered the iron. For a moment, he did not straighten. When he did, the posture was different, no longer announcing height, only finding balance. "Now you can call your dogs," Lemuel said, softer. "And when they come, you can tell them which man to take. Or you can keep walking with me, and you can be returned to your porch at dawn with your body unspoiled and your mind spoiled for the work you plan." Ransom's face shifted so plainly some part of him must have hated its transparency. He stood between two words, brother and master, and neither would fit comfortably in his mouth again. He did not lift the horn. Instead he said, quietly, "What would you ask of me if I were a man who listened?" Lemuel let himself breathe once before answering. "3 names," he said. 3 families you will not sell, no matter the debt. You will write them on paper tomorrow and sign with your father's name if you must. And one more thing, when Ferris lays a trap, you will lead him to water where the mud keeps no print. You have the talent for misdirection. Use it for once where it belongs." Ransom swallowed. "Names," he repeated, as if tasting a fruit for ripeness he has only ever thrown at people. "Say them." "Jacob and his mother Hester," Lemuel said, and the knight nodded because it had expected this. "Dinah and Hale." "Old Cuff." "Cuff is no profit to anyone," Ransom muttered as reflex. "Then it should cost you nothing to keep him," Lemuel said. "Which makes it a good lesson for you." A noise feathered the far side of the slough, oars where no oars should be. "Back," Lemuel murmured, and they retraced with the quick care of men crossing a floor newly polished. The skiff received them, the shackle went back into its nest, and the water took their haste in the gentlest way, smoothing the wake as if erasing a mistake on a primer page. When Belfield rose out of the paling dark, Ransom stepped from the skiff a different height than he'd stepped in. Ferris was waiting again, and this time he had not pretended to be elsewhere watching elk paths. His eyes met Ransom's, seeking. Ransom shrugged the look away. "Nothing," he said. "They are ghosts." Ferris did not believe in ghosts. He believed in men and the habits of their legs. He stared at Lemuel over Ransom's shoulder and let the stare mean everything the law would happily print on a placard if given cause. The letter with the 3 names arrived at the big house the next evening, delivered by Ransom's own hand to Mrs. Annalise, who read it and saw in her son a posture she did not recognize and did not wish to interrogate. She signed a note to Ferris: "Hold these in reserve. Not to be touched. Ask for others." Ferris read the names and nearly smiled. Not because he would keep them safe, because he had just been told where the soft places in the yard had been declared dear to someone other than him. He sharpened his plans accordingly. 2 days later, while Lemuel was setting a hoop with the tidy violence the task requires, a writer came in with dust for clothing and a story in his mouth. They say a federal man asked questions at Rockets. He told anyone whose ears were open. Says the river's got a conscience. Says Quakers feed it. Says a boy from Belfield went missing a night last week and came back looking like he'd heard a sermon he didn't like. He laughed the brittle laugh that holds off being recruited to a cause by pretending not to care. Ransom heard the tale from the porch and blurred, for a moment, like heat on a road. He called for lemonade and did not drink it. That night, Ferris took 2 men and no lanterns and sat like a stump behind the ash yard, watching nothing until nothing turned to something. He waited for a boy and found only air. He waited for a woman and heard only wind. He did not see the wagon that had learned a new route since last week. He did not see the small ledger Lemuel kept under the floorboard grow by another bead. He did see old Cuff, at last, slip from his pallet and go slow into the yard, coughing the way a building speaks before it falls. Ferris's hand throbbed on his pistol. "Where you going, old tree?" he called. "To piss in the place you plan to sleep," Cuff retorted cheerfully, then coughed his laugh into a wheeze that could have been made by the wind itself. Ferris stepped from shadow. "I hear you been singing too much," he said. "Songs stir dogs." Cuff drew up. "Songs stir men, if they listening. Dogs only hear bones." He turned his head and spat. "What you listening for, Ferris?" Ferris let the silence grow its own fangs. Cuff's gaze did not drop. The overseer did not draw iron, he did not need to. He walked away as if he had achieved something simply by deciding not to act today. Cuff came back to the pallet and smiled to himself for a time as if he had just checked an old snare and found it intact. Everything as it was cannot last, even when men with guns beg it to. The night of breaking came in on a moth's wing. A new man, hired by Ferris without even the trouble of a handshake, brought with him the habit of boasting. He'd worked the docks at Rockets and a week in a trader's pen. He had a scar shaped like a comma over one eye and the grammar of a bully. He told Ferris, in a voice meant to sell himself as useful, that a woman with a pocked cheek, ugly as a sow, he said, not knowing his insult was the rope he would trip on, had been seen with a man who looked like a walking fence post. He did not know their names. He knew only that he hated faces that arranged themselves without asking him first. Ferris listened. He offered the man whiskey, which the man drank like a decision. They saddled at midnight and took the long road where men who do not understand rivers choose to ride. 2 others followed, one with a horn he longed to blow, one with a Bible under his shirt because his wife believed it kept men from shooting straight at him. Lemuel had the skiff in the water already, a barrel with a false bottom loaded with no one yet, a contingency and a promise. Jacob stood barefoot at the edge, watching the sky with a fisherman's logic. Dinah waited 2 bends upstream with Hale pressed to her, listening like a doe in autumn. They heard the horses before they saw the men. Lemuel's blood arranged itself for rapid changes. "Go," he breathed toward the dark where Dinah had hidden. The dark did not answer with words, but he trusted it did as told. Ferris entered the bank clearing with a strange calm, like a man who has at last persuaded himself that outcome is only a matter of posture. He held a pistol loose, which is more dangerous than tight. The new man grinned. "Evening, Thorne," Ferris said, as if they were neighbors surprised at the well. Lemuel straightened. "Evening." His staff stayed casual in his palm. The river pretended not to listen. "Were you gone just now?" Ferris asked, tone strolling. "Know where a man can ride," Lemuel said. Ferris's smile tilted. You like riddles. I got one. What do a cooper and a ferryman have in common? Lemuel did not answer. They both pretend the world is round, Ferris said, then sighed like a teacher. Bring the barrel, he told the new man, and the man obediently bent to the one with the corpse scar. Careful, Lemuel said, and the word jumped from his mouth before he could starve it. The new man grinned wider. He had found a button. Ransom arrived then, the last person Lemuel had hoped the night would spare. He came at a canter and slid off in a motion that practiced itself into grace. He took one look at the geometry of men and trees and understood enough to make trouble or to make something else. What are you doing, Ferris? He asked, voice lined with the respect he kept for the overseer only when it cost nothing. Ferris did not look at him. Repairing leaks, he said. Beginning with this barrel. He jerked his chin. The new man pried at the lid. Lemuel's knuckles whitened on the staff, not because a person hid in the hollow, but because a symbol did, and symbols bleed when cut even if they have no flesh. The lid came up. The shackle glinted. Ransom inhaled, an old sound. Ferris made a noise like a man finding a coin too small to spend. The new man said, "What'd I tell you? Tools is tools." Ransom stepped forward before his caution could edit him. "That is mine," he said, and his voice almost believed it. "A piece from the old days. I asked Thorne to salvage iron for sale." Ferris turned, slow. "You a collector, now?" Ransom's mouth moved once around the word yes and failed to chase it down. He did not look at Lemuel. Looking would make the lie too clear. The new man snorted. "Ain't no gentleman saving shackle iron unless he's saving it for use. This here's proof enough." He lifted the thing, and his hand had the disrespect of a man picking up a cat by its tail. Lemuel took a step without permission. "Put it down," he said, and the knight heard in his tone the end of a long patience. The new man turned, delighted. "Or what?" The oar came faster than thought. Ransom's palm snapped, quicker than his own judgment, and knocked the iron from the man's grip. It hit the mud with a thunk that sounded like a verdict. Everyone stood stunned by the fact that he had touched the moment. Ferris's face hardened, at Ransom's insolence, at his own misreckoning, at the way the knight kept failing to be a page he could write. "Enough," Ferris said, and the word sought to become a shot. He raised his pistol. Tempe Howell's voice came from the trees like a bell left under a bed. "No," she said, "just that, no sermon, no addendum." And the dark transformed. Figures unstuck themselves from the margin and showed their ordinary bodies, farmers. Women with shawls. A boy so thin the wind could wear his clothes. Reeves, that familiar post in the ground that makes the fence make sense. No guns in their hands. Only ropes, poles, and one long-handled hoe bright with honest kitchen lighting. Ferris aimed at the idea of them. Ransom moved again. Not toward Lemuel, toward Ferris. He caught the overseer's wrist and shoved the barrel aside. The pistol fired into the river where it hurt no one but the water. The new man lunged for Ransom with a snarl that suggested he had mislaid his childhood and had been looking to blame someone since. Lemuel met him. He did not swing the staff like a weapon. He placed it where the man's shin would land and let momentum perform the rest. The man let down in the reeds with a noise that resembled prayer only in syllable count. Reeves stepped in and removed the pistol from his reach with a gentle foot. Ferris and Ransom struggled like two dogs who have forgotten why they started it. Then Ferris remembered he was older and meaner and flipped the boy hard enough to steal his breath. He set the pistol's still-hot barrel on Ransom's temple just to see how the world would look with that arranged. "Stop," Lemuel said, and he meant the whole story. Tempe moved, slow as a Sunday and just as sure, placing herself so the pistol would have to be pointed through her to get its favorite work. "This is your last good choice," she said to Ferris. "The one before the next one costs your soul." Ferris sneered at the word soul like a man sneers at a vegetable. His finger tightened. Before the shot could make itself true, Old Cuff's cough burst the yard wide open like thunder. He was there, when had he come, at the path's mouth, leaning on Jacob, who was built mostly of worry and stubbornness. Cuff's eyes shone under the lamp of his own fever. He took in the scene, designed his exit from the world, and coughed a laugh. "Ferris," he said in a voice no one had ever heard on his tongue, clear, even, ringing. "You still little." The overseer flinched at a pronunciation that reached across years and jobs to put him back in the first room he had ever failed in. His aim flickered. "Put it down," Cuff suggested, not unkind, as if offering a tired man a place to sit. "Let that boy live long enough to choose his next wrong thing without your help." Ferris's arm trembled. He looked at Ransom, who was not an ally, not an enemy, just a mirror, and then at Lemuel, who was neither of those, either, but something harder to carry. He lowered the pistol. Not as surrender. As delay. "We're done for tonight," he spat. He looked at the new man, who was bleeding indignation into the reeds. "Get up. We go." He pointed at Lemuel. "You," he said, and the word waited in the air like a nail. "Tomorrow." They left with an ugliness more ambitious than injury. The trees exhaled. Reeves tipped his chin toward Tempe, who answered with a raise of her hand, the liturgy of this congregation. Ransom sat up, breath returning on fast feet. He did not stand. He stared at the wet pistol mark on his temple as if it were a planet he had just discovered he lived on. He looked at Lemuel and opened his mouth to say a word he feared would cost him if it came out. "Go," Lemuel said instead, not unkindly. "And use the dawn better than you used the night." Ransom rose and went, a man whose boots had learned something his head would take longer to grasp. Old Cuff folded, then, in Jacob's arms like a coat that has done its job. Tempe knelt so fast her bonnet fell. Lemuel caught Cuff's hand and put it to his own cheek the way a child might without shame. "River," Cuff whispered, and the word gathered every word he'd ever needed. "Run." His breath left him, and in its place a hush settled that did not ask permission. They buried him at the tree that gave the best shade to children. Not at the back, not where bones lose their names, but near enough that when the wind takes a mind to speak, folks can hear. Lemuel carved Cuff's name into a small plank with the drawknife he had sharpened that morning. He set it at the head and pressed his palm to the earth until the earth told him it understood. Grief took its taxes and then did what the merciful kind does, it handed back instruction. Lemuel stood from the grave and knew the next thing. Not because it was easy, because it was time. He went to the big house before noon and asked to see Ransom. Men in that house forgot that asking could be a weapon. Ransom met him on the side porch where the lemon trees tried at a perfume that did not belong in this soil. His eyes were the color of long thinking that hurt. "We are not brothers," Ransom said before Lemuel could speak, and at last the word was honest, even if it broke something that had been wrong to begin with. "No," Lemuel agreed. "We are not. But we share a river. And you've been drowning in it on dry land your whole life." Ransom winced and smiled at the truth like he might smile at a beggar with the prettiest voice he'd ever heard. "You will leave this place," he said, surprising himself. "You will take as many as you can. I will make a mess of the books and call the sheriff at the wrong hour and send Ferris to the elk path until he grows antlers. And then I will do some wrong thing again because I have not yet learned how to stop making my father out of whatever stands nearby." Lemuel drew breath and let it out through his nose. "That's a start." Ransom looked over Lemuel's shoulder. Mrs. Annalise watching from the parlor's gauze, praying to a God who enjoyed pretty parlors. Ferris in the yard, hands behind his back like they were tied and he was practicing hating it. Jacob in the farther shadow, pretending to search for something small he had not lost. The world, arranging itself. "I'll send you a map," Ransom said in a rush before his courage could find a couch. "Of patrols. Of men who drink too much to ride well. I will put 3 families on the account as already sold to a man who died last year. Let them be invisible for a while." Lemuel nodded once. He did not say thank you. He said, "Keep your word in daylight." He turned to go, then paused. "When you meet the federal man, because he will come, do not tell him your own name too loudly. He will sell you a heaven you cannot afford and a hatred you will buy too easily. Ransom almost laughed. You think me recruitable? I think you ache to belong and will take the cheapest belonging offered, Lemuel said. Choose the expensive kind. He left. He walked not to the shed, not to the river, but to the quarters, where he stood beside Cuff's fresh mound and let his shadow fall there long enough to stitch something in him he had not realized was unraveling. They moved the last of them 3 nights later, in a procession that would have looked like a miracle from above and like a poor man's raggedy farm chore from the road. Lemuel led with the staff, Reeves brought up the end with a hoe slung like a guitar. Tempe carried nothing visible, in her eyes, 2 lists argued, those saved and those not yet. Dinah held Hale until he refused to be held and then let him walk between her and Jacob because a boy must learn his feet. At the burnt gum stump, Lemuel turned and looked back the way he never allowed himself to look. Belfield lay under a moon like an apology. In some room, Ransom wrote a letter not to be sent. In another, Mrs. Annalise set a glass on a table and shook because she had lost something her life had taught her not to name. Ferris made a knot, looser than usual, and did not know why his hand refused to tighten it. River, Lemuel said under his breath. Remember us. The river replied with the unassuming faithfulness of water, I always do. They went into the dark, which felt like a mouth and a door and a bed and a road. They went not as property, not as ghosts, but as bodies learning again a grammar older than chains. Lemuel walked with his eyes just ahead so as not to trip over anyone else's fear, his ears tuned to the small bad sounds a night can make just before it goes worse. He did not think about dawn, not because he doubted it, but because night asked to be honored simply for surviving it. At the second safe place, a tobacco barn emptied of its poison and filled with quilts, Tempe drew Lemuel aside. There is a man on the federal line who will ask you to swear, she said. He will love your courage and try to turn it into a sword. Beware swords and men who have never chopped wood. Lemuel smiled, thin. I like barrels. I know, she said. Keep liking them. He slept 2 hours in a breath that tasted like hay and apples, woke to Hale's palm on his cheek, sticky with someone's candy he had found like grace. He laughed despite death and loss and the river's fatigue. The laugh sounded like old Cuff's for an instant, which is how you know no one goes on. Toward evening, the last crossing, the Pamunkey's broad, brown language opening into the York's Promise. A flatboat ferryman with a face as tired as a saint made room for more than money could explain. He squinted at Lemuel a second too long and then looked away. He had been a man learning not to know names on purpose for 20 years and had become an artist at it. When they set foot on the other side, Reed shook Lemuel's hand like a brother, not the kind tied by blood, the kind tied by choosing. From here, others know the road better, he said. You've done what you said you would. That is rarer than gunpowder. Tempe took Lemuel's face between both palms, as a mother does or a priest. You lead now, she said. Away from us. Towards your people and towards yourself. Lemuel did not argue. He lifted Hale onto his shoulders because weight of the right sort is a blessing. He nodded to Dinah, to Jacob, to the old woman with a single gold tooth who had not said her name aloud in 2 years. He turned his back on a house that had harvested him and faced a road that would require a crop of patience bigger than any field he had ever seen. Behind them, in a county that had learned to fear its own reflection, Ransom Bellamy sat on the porch steps as dusk took the last nobility from his false ideas. He held in his hand a sheet with 3 names. He read them aloud like prayer, then burned the paper so Ferris would find only ash. He watched the smoke climb and thought of a brother who wasn't in a river that was. Ferris, later that week, would ride to Howell's farm and find it empty of everything but decency. He would ride to the burnt gum stump and lose a boot to the rumor of a bog. He would ask the sheriff for men and get them, and they would catch exactly no one because the underground had moved its track 2 inches south, and that, sometimes, is all that is required to undo an empire. Lemuel, a month on, would stand in a Pennsylvania yard where the snow came down as if it trusted the ground, and he would set his drawknife to an oak plank as freely as if his hands had never been owned. He would read a newspaper in a corner by a stove while Hale slept across his lap and Dinah's breath measured time with the ticking clock. He would learn the names of men whose speeches knit up his anger into neat rows and men whose quiet deeds put bread in his palm. He would send back, through routes so clever even his river would admire them, letters made of the smallest words and the largest meanings. And he would never forget the way Ransom had said names, as if tasting a food too expensive for his table. One night in that honest cold, a letter reached Lemuel without stamp, without seal, written in a script that still leaned wrong. It said only, "They are safe. For now. Ferris looks elsewhere. I will do one more right thing before I am myself again. R." Lemuel folded the paper slow. He set it under the string ledger where beads counted what couldn't be printed. He did not smile or curse or pray. He simply breathed, and the breath went out into a world that had made, over and over, too small containers for a man like him, and the breath did not come back smaller. He went outside and looked up at a sky that allowed itself to be as wide as it is. Snow tapped his face like a friend. He lifted Hale down from the railing and handed the boy a plane to shave slivers from the first plank of a new barrel. Hale's curls brightened with sawdust. "Patience," Lemuel said, as if speaking to a craft and to a country at once. "Curve to the hoop. Hold true in a storm." Across the miles, a river he had loved repeated the same lesson to cypress knees and mud. It spoke to a house called Belfield whether anyone in it was listening or not. It reminded a man named Ransom every morning that there are two kinds of drowning and he had tasted both. The underground kept moving. Men and women learned to use their feet as if God had put maps in them. Tempe Howell grew older and then older still, and her pocked cheek frightened fewer children each year because their mothers pointed to her and said, "This is what beauty looks like when it has done hard work." Reeves used up 3 hose and 2 hats and laughed more often for no good reason. Jacob grew into his shoulders and into the habit of not speaking unless silence would do harm. Dinah found in her voice a way to tell the past that made it a lamp and not a chain. Lemuel Thorne did not become famous. He became himself, which is rarer. His literacy, once a still fish in a deep pool, came up now and then to shine on the surface long enough to feed whole families. And if anyone asked him, after many winters, how he had betrayed the master's son to the Underground Railroad, he would say, "I did not betray him. I delivered him to a night where he could choose to be better." He would not add that the man chose only sometimes. He would not call that failure. He would call it weather. The last barrel he made in that Pennsylvania yard, years later, with Hale standing taller than his collarbone, held cider sweet enough to make old men weep at county gatherings. Lemuel hoisted it onto a wagon with a grunt that held joy. He had shaved the staves thin and bent them without breaking, the way a man learns to bend a life. As he set the last hoop, he whispered to it what he had long ago learned to say to himself, "Hold. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications."